I want to welcome you to the revived Speakers Forum. We took 2 months off for the month of August and then for the Jewish holidays. Welcome back. Tonight, we have the honor of hearing from Jackie Williams. I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing Jackie, and then as usual, we'll move into her presentation. And at the end, we'll have time for some questions and answers. As Jackie said while we were chatting at the beginning, maybe before some of you logged in, she grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm not allowed to say Louisville. And she began writing in the late 1970s. One day she sent an article about low-fat recipes for cereal to the Washington Post. And I guess to her surprise, they published it. Yeah.
Article.
Run up and
You may see it, but they call it Slender in the Grass.
okay, let me do a little magic here. And there we go. That's the article. And that's the continuation of the article. And you can see the style section of the Washington Post, February 15, 1979. That's when I was just 2 years old. So.
Did you have to say that?
Right. Thank you, Linda.
And was I rude to laugh?
Then she went on to have articles in Portland, Oregon, Miami, San Diego newspapers. She gave cooking classes featuring no fat, no sugar, no salt. Sounds terrible. And she's
leaving now. You said that and she's leaving.
Oh no. She worked with an organization called Science in the Public Interest, which asked her to write for a publication called Nutrition Action, which she did. She became interested in culinary history, and she sent articles to the Washington State Historical Association.
Excuse me, Stuart, this is the Nutrition Action, the publication.
Okay. And these were some of the articles she sent to the Washington State Historical Association, were published in their journal, which is called Columbia. She's gonna, okay, there we go. Oh, that's nice, a nice picture. She's going to go into these things in detail, so I'm a kind of a spoiler alert here.
Yeah.
Anyway, she wrote a book called Wagon Wheel Kitchens, which was published by the University Press of Kansas in 1993. It tells a story about pioneers traveling the Oregon Trail and what they ate, and the book is still in print. The Washington State University asked her to write a book about Pacific Northwest history. And she wrote another book, which was, as a result, called The Way We Ate, which came out in 1996. Her third book was co-authored with Molly Cohn, the late Molly Cohn, and Howard Droker. I know Howard Droker. He was a real estate lawyer. Part of my life as a lawyer, I was a real estate lawyer, and I know him through Temple de Hirsch. Anyway, they wrote a book, Family of Strangers, Building a Jewish Community in Washington State, which was published by the University of Washington Press in association with Washington State Jewish Historical Organization, and it's soon going to be digitized. Finally, she decided to write a book about Capitol Hill, and the result of that was The Hill with a Future, Seattle's Capitol Hill, 1900 to 1946, which came out in 2001. I believe there was a recent edition, which I am the proud owner of. I say that a little hesitantly because I loaned it to my friend Louis and I haven't seen it since, but I went to the party in which the book was brought out, and I actually have a signed copy by the author. Thank you, Jackie.
Oh, thank you for purchasing it. No, it's been this book is just Paul Dorpat. If you remember him, used to have a column in the Seattle paper,
Yeah.
Seattle Times paper now and then. And Paul mentioned it in his column. And I had self-published this book. The others had academic presses, but I thought I knew enough about publishing. So I got a grant from the county and I published it. And he put it in his column. And I just got orders just constantly came in. And my friend said, oh, you don't want to do that. But I kind of enjoyed it. I set up a spreadsheet and sent them out and took them to the post office. It was fun to do. And I turned over all the rights to the Capitol Hill Historical Society. So they're the ones that are going to benefit from it. And they hope to digitize it. I guess the whole world is going to be digitized someday.
So Jackie told me that today she's writing about her life. She's going to call it What I Remember, Record of a Life. Actually, she's been working on this for 5 years. As the more she writes, the more she remembers. So I'm going to shut up and let the person who knows more about this than me take over. Thanks, Jackie. It's all
Thank
yours.
you. But Stu, aren't you going to, I thought you were going to show what I wrote about writing and you were going to put that up. Are you not doing that?
You mean that article from the Washington Post?
No. I did writing and you said you're going to put it on up to, and so I won't be, people will have a copy of it. I misunderstood you if I didn't.
Oh, you mean the text of what you're,
Yes.
oh, no, I'm not sure I got a full text.
Because I'm gonna have to find it because I didn't print it because I thought you were gonna do that.
All right, well, I'll just make it up while you look, so.
But I can talk. I can talk about what I did in my writing if and sort of ad lib. I had never wanted to be a writer. That was the last thing I wanted to do. I always took science and biology classes in college. I became a medical technologist and worked in a lab. If I had it to do over again, I would have finished up. Back in those days, all you needed was 2 years of college, and then you had a year of training in a hospital that had a certified laboratory. And so I did that in Louisville, and then became a medical technologist and worked until our first son was born, and he's now 61. So it's been a few years ago, and then I stopped working. And so say if I had it to do over again, I would have hopefully gotten at least a master's or PhD in science, but I never thought about it in those days. All I wanted to do was get married and have kids. And I changed along the way, but that was my desire at that point. We've lived in many places because my husband was with the university and he had grants. And so I've lived in London, Bergen, Norway, and Fort Wayne, Indiana. One summer, the money he got was with Lincoln Life Insurance. I have no idea how he persuaded them to let him interview the women employees there and give them a grant to pay for the summer. But nevertheless, we lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana for about 6 weeks. I don't remember much about it. Other than our son was about 3 or 4, taking him for walks, and there was an eclipse, whether it was the sun or the moon. I just remember there was an eclipse that summer. And then we were in DC for a long time. We lived there. And when the Office of Economic Opportunity started, OEO, and Buddy was asked to join as an associate director. And we moved to DC for only a year, but we stayed for 5 years. And then when the Republicans came in, and goodness, when was that? 72, 70, that's when we moved. He decided to go back to academic life, and the University of Washington came calling. And as I say, it was going to be for a year. We had bought a house in Maryland, and I thought this was going to be home. And but Seattle is home, and I love living here. And it's turned out just been a wonderful life to lived in Seattle, Washington. I became involved in the Jewish community. We joined Beth Am. Our sons were bar mitzvahed there. I became active in the Jewish community. And when I moved after Buddy died in 2011, and I moved to First Hill in 2012 in a condo. And then I gave up my car, and it was too far to go to Beth Am. And I have friends who still belong there, of course, but I hate to ask people. And so I tried out Bet Olive, and I loved going to Bet Olive. And I found it a very warm congregation and very friendly people. So I even look forward to going to services on Friday night. I must confess I'm across the street and don't have to drive. So that makes it very, very, very nice. But I certainly enjoyed that aspect. And I like living in Seattle. I like living on First Hill. I'm close. I can walk to every place, to the library, to the bus, to Bet Olive. So that's worked out very, very well. I still continue to write. Stu said that I was writing about my life, and I am. I first thought I would just be chronological. You know, I was born, I grew up, and blah, blah, blah. But the more I write, the more I remember, and I've expanded it. I've also sort of annotated it. So growing up in Louisville in 1937, there was a big flood that affected everybody's life there. My parents and everybody, stores, and the water was pretty high. And so then I inserted that about the flood in Louisville. And so things like that. In fact, I had a cousin who was older than my mother, who was a swimmer, and he went around in his rowboat picking up people to take them. I don't know where he took them, but I do have a picture of them and an article in the paper about Cousin Doc, as we call them, picking up people during that 37 flood. And then I've done things, I continued during the war, how the war affected us. We were near Fort Knox. And so the government was afraid of Fort Knox being bombed. And there were a lot of soldiers in town. We always had soldiers for dinner for all the holidays, the Jewish holidays, Thanksgiving. The B'nai B'rith in Louisville was very active in making sure that soldiers who were stationed at Fort Knox had homes and to go to for the holidays. And then I was in Louisville till we got married. Buddy was stationed in Indiana. He was fulfilling his ROTC duties, and he looked up his fraternity that he was in at the University of Texas, and the rest is history. He was a Sammy. With Walter Williams, people didn't think he was Jewish, but he was. And so we moved around a bit.
Jackie, let me ask you some questions.
Please do, because otherwise I just would rattle on all night.
Yeah. How did you come to write that article in the Washington Post about low-fat recipes?
Yeah, when I think back on it, I'm not exactly sure. I do remember we were living in Maryland, and I had been ice skating. Every once in a while, the creeks in Maryland would freeze over, and I came home and decided I was going to do this. I knew Buddy was starting to have heart disease, coronary artery disease, and Nathan Pritikin was starting to come out and talk about low-fat recipes, and I thought, well, I'll try that. And that's when I sent that article into the Washington Post. I made these cereals that I made for him. And actually, I said Washington. We were living in Seattle by that time. And so we were getting the Post. It had been our local newspaper. We had it sent to us out here. I knew they had a food section. The local papers didn't have much. Seattle Times or the PI didn't. And I just sat down and wrote this and sent it off. When I think about it, it was kind of gutsy. I knew nothing about publishing, writing articles, what you were supposed to do, that you were supposed to query first. But I sent it in and they did 3 articles. And then that was it. I never did another one for them. And so that's when the Center for Science and the Public Interest, which was a lobbying group in DC for good nutrition, they picked it up and they asked me to write for them. And then various places asked me, and I started sending articles around, and then decided to write a book, which had nothing to do with low fat. But I found out I liked to write by that time, and I loved history. I knew the Oregon Trail was going to be celebrating its 150th anniversary, I believe. And I sent a query letter to the University Press of Kansas. And academic presses usually send it out for peer review, and they have to get 2 people to sign on. And they were looking for something like that. And they gave me a contract. When I think about it, it's kind of miraculous. And I start writing. I love doing the research. And that was before the days of everything being digitized. You went to the library and you got a newspaper, and you got the big newspaper, and you had to just read it. There was no thing that you could punch and say, show me the Oregon Trail. You just had to read all those newspapers. And the Seattle Public Library has actually a very good collection of newspapers, as does the UW Press. So I use those. I just sat down and read the newspapers. And then I did go to, there was I think in Independence is where the Oregon Trail started. And there was an organization, it was called the OCTA, Oregon California Trail Association. And they were gathering, by that time, they were starting to gather the information, and they were gathering it also in California, because that's when the pioneers split. Some came to Oregon and some went all the way down, like the Donner Party that everybody knows about. And so there was a big organization there to help and say where some of the information was. And I concentrated on the food aspect of it. Where was the refrigerator? How did they get refrigeration on this trail? How did they get cooking oil? What did they use for a shelter? So it was interesting to do. And it's been in several editions. And The Way We Ate is the one. I did the same thing for the Northwest. When did refrigeration come in here? When did electricity? When did we get all that? And they are going to WSU. They are going to reprint it, but just like this, I don't think they're going to correct anything else. But I'm sure eventually they will digitize, since the whole world is going to be digitized. And I'll be glad to take any questions that anybody wants to ask me.
Well, Jackie, when we talked yesterday, I was really curious about your research. Whether anybody wrote down any recipes while they were on the trail. You told me about some guidebooks that the pioneers had. Some of them didn't know what they were talking about. And some of them.
That's right, Stu. And people wrote letters. And the people that were in the wagons, many of them wrote letters back home. And the people saved them. And the University of Washington has a wonderful collection of letters that were sent back and forth. And some of them would, I remember one lady in particular, she had a little girl. And she was telling, and she had a dress for this little girl. And she said, sometimes we will dress her up. And she sent a piece of the material back home to her family. And people were really eager to get these letters. And as I say, they kept them. And you can read them. And they are now, I think they're digitized at the UW, but they have the original letters in special collections at the University of Washington. And they also have them at some other universities too. Oregon had a wonderful collection of manuscripts that people went, because a lot of them were going to Oregon rather than Washington. That's where they were going, the early ones. But they started coming in 1937, and then the big push was in 1943 when there was a big wagon train coming out. And so a lot of them split off once they get across the Bitterroot Mountains and went south to Oregon. But some of them did go east to Walla Walla when that area was settled much earlier than Seattle. They went there, and of course it was wilderness. There were no people, the natives were here, but there were no stores, and they had to go to find water. The big thing for them was to find a site that was near water where they could put a well. I mean, that was the big thing that was so important, was to get water. And, in Eastern Washington, there's not a lot of water. Wasn't a lot of water then. And I think until Grand Coulee Dam came in, there was not a lot of water that people could, it was difficult. So that was a big problem, where water was. And they followed the rivers coming out on the trail. And so it was important. That was important because they could get water. And by the time they got out here, and then some of them, as they came here, a lot of them split and went down to Oregon. And that was, they went down the middle of Oregon, not on the coast, through the Dalles and that area down there. And that's pretty dry too. So it was important to be near a river. And that was probably when they were going, was a little before the big cholera epidemic, but then there was a cholera epidemic, and I don't think people knew then that it was the water, but that's what was causing it. Was some of the water causing cholera all over the country. It was their pandemic at that time.
Did you find some surprising things that they discovered that they could eat along the way?
Well, they weren't used to eating green vegetables. That was not part of their diet. Most of the diet was probably potatoes and meat. And so they picked certain areas and fortunately, they didn't write about anybody if they picked about something poisonous if they died, but they were picking some of the greens. And I think in the book I had a chapter on greens that they were picking. And so they did that, and they shot deer and whatever they could find for meat, because they were carrying something called hardtack, which was, they had dried some of their meat before leaving, but they didn't have enough. They didn't really realize how long it was going to take. And the guidebooks were really pretty useless because some of the people that wrote the guidebooks had never been on the trails, but they gave them a list of what they should carry and what clothes they should take. Some of that was good, some of it wasn't good. Rain was a problem once they got in certain areas. Certainly when they went across the prairies, rain was not a problem. They wished for some rain. So it was a heroic trip. It took almost 6 months for them when they were leaving, because they were leaving the Midwest and coming, they called them, in Independence, Missouri was one of the places, they called them jumping off places, where a lot of people from maybe different areas would meet and they'd form an Oregon, a trail. I mean, a wagon train. There would be several of these wagons going across. And in one part, there's somebody's was writing down, was either able to understand what some of the natives were saying or else just put words in their mouth. They said they saw these white canvases coming across the trail, across the mountains. There might be 5 or 6 wagons and with canvas covering. And so that if you didn't know what you were seeing, that might scare you, to see all these folks coming in and taking over their land, which is what they did. Unfortunately, didn't do it in a very nice way, but that's what they did. They came over, and in 1855, the government was giving land to anybody who came out and was giving them 160 acres. And regardless of the fact that it was somebody else's land, they just gave it to people. And if you were married, or it was, you would get twice that amount, and you could establish a homestead. And that's what a lot of people did, is settle down on that land. And there were some, later on, there were some decisions as to what the boundaries of that land was, because it wasn't always registered that exactly. And the National Archives that are here in Seattle, out 35th, I forget where it is, but they have a lot of these surveys that people were doing out from Washington, that you can go out there and read some of the documents. They have a wonderful collection, or they did. It's probably all digitized now.
Jackie, would you tell us how Capitol Hill was in your book?
The Hill with the Future. Well, nobody knows for sure. Arthur Denny is attributed to saying that it was Capitol Hill. The couple of historians, you really got me because I don't remember the names, but a couple of historians who looked up this, gosh, I'm just blanking on his name, Capitol Hill. It's on a map early on in early map, but they just decided. Some people think because somebody's wife came from a place in Michigan, where is the Michigan lady, that there was a Capitol Hill there, something like that. I must confess that I don't remember exactly, but it was not because they wanted the Capitol in Seattle. It was definitely not that, because they had already decided before they plotted Capitol Hill here, they had already decided the Capitol was going to be in Olympia. So it has nothing to do with anything like that. It's just that somebody decided to name it, and they got the deed, as I say, from the government, giving them. And the original part of Capitol Hill was 12th to 20th Roy de Gaylor, not Roy de Gaylor. Roy de Gaylor. That's where it was. And so it was just the 160 acres. And then people kept buying more and more land. And of course, it was expanded pretty quickly. And then the transportation came out. And interesting, when the first streetcars came, they went up 19th. And I think there's still a bus on 19th. I took it many a time to go into the city. So we lived on 22nd between Gaylor and Highland. I lived there for 42 years. So the kids went to my one went to Stevens. They went to Madrona, Meany, and Garfield. So they're both graduates of Garfield High School. So I liked living there. We had a old houses built in 25, and the people that owned it, the name on the deed, and I don't think he ever knew he owned it, was Dan Evans. But I think somehow owned that property. It must have been part of the Warehouser or something like that, because I don't think he ever knew he lived there, but that's the name that was on the deed. So we were surprised when we signed it. And that's not who owned it at that point, but just the original owner. That again, my son David can find anything, and so he looked all this stuff up.
Well, I've been monopolizing the questions. Anybody else want to jump in with a question?
Cindy.
Hi, Jackie. Thank you. This is fascinating. I'm actually curious as about the content of the writing, but also about your process. It seems like you love it and it comes easily. And do you ever get stuck, or do you have like a disciplined time that you write, or do you just feel like it so you write a lot?
Well, when I was writing these books, I was at my computer at 8 o'clock in the morning. I mean, I'm an early riser and I was there early. My husband wrote about 10 books and he did help me, telling me how, he said, just do it. And I really did just start writing. And then I had to cut so much of it out. And when I was sending queries around, and I had sent it to the University Press of Kansas, and I just sent it to them. And they, as I say, they really wanted to do something because of the celebration of the Oregon Trail going through that area of the country. And they had they eventually, even after I signed a contract, they had somebody read it and make suggestions of what to leave out. And so I did have to cut it a lot. I mean, which is very difficult. I mean, you think your words are just, going to win a Nobel Prize or something. And here they're going to cut them. But they were right. And you can't do everything in a book. You have to really discipline yourself. And when I wrote The Way We Ate, again, I was very lucky that the WSU asked me to write it. I didn't even have to query them because they saw the success of that. But again, I had to cut. I wanted to put in everything that they did. So, I mean, that's part of having a good editor. I mean, it's really necessary to have a good editor. And Kansas supplied a content editor and a copy editor, which was really very good. And that's really very important. I mean, you think that you've written it so well, but they look at it from a different perspective. And it's the tendency is to have a friend read it, and a friend is probably not a very good person to read it because they won't think it's wonderful. So if you're going to write a book, a history book, then you need an outside editor. I mean, writing fiction is a whole different ballgame. I could never do that. I have no imagination, so I couldn't do that. But I suspect even the good fiction writers I'm sure they have editors.
Some of them need editors.
Well, that's true. But I like to think I don't read those books. Read something. I'm reading a really interesting book about, and it is nonfiction. It's a bookseller in Florence, and talking about this one store and people that some of the books that they printed, early manuscripts, and about manuscripts and bookbinding, and which is fascinating. Really fascinating. Anyone else?
Jackie, I'm just curious as to the 160 acres on Capitol Hill belong to one person?
That's what they were doing that for a few years. I mean, they didn't do it forever, but in 1855, somewhere around then, the federal government, they wanted, it was, the railroads were coming out here. They wanted the land settled. And so you could get 155 acres of different places that were given to you. And, by the time in like our house was built in 25, they weren't doing that. The houses are lined up we lived on 22nd, and there's not a lot of space in between houses. But they were doing that early on in 55, 60s. And then probably I think I used to, I'm not positive, but I'm sure by the time the Civil War started in 64, they weren't doing that anymore, but.
So,
I'm
so
not
you were in
really-
you were in the same neighborhood as the Schoenfelds.
Yeah, I used to know where they lived, but I can't remember now, but yeah,
Schoenfelds and Sternoffs.
yeah,
were- I know that I grew up on Capitol Hill myself.
yeah, I think I knew that, Bill. I think you did tell me, but I can't, did you live on Prospect? No.
Between Prospect and Aloha on 16th.
Yeah. We were between Gaylor and Highland on 22nd. And yeah, we were kind of, when we bought that house, people thought we were nuts to buy that house because the neighborhood was in transition then. And we said, we talked about integrated areas, schools, and we thought we should put our money where our mouth was. So the kids did go to the public schools, Stevens, Meany, Madrona, Garfield. It was a good neighborhood, and it became very, very popular, particularly after 1973. That when oil prices were going up, there was the OPEC crisis, and prices, but we paid very little for that house when we bought it.
Jackie, I lived on 21st Avenue East, just off of Gaylor,
Oh goodness, you were right behind us.
just for about 20 years.
Oh,
I love that neighborhood.
Yeah.
I'll throw in one little anecdote. Years before, I was looking with a friend. We were going to set up a little commune, and there was a house right off Volunteer Park. There's one house there that looks like the White House.
Oh, I
It's-
know where that one is. Yes, that
Yeah.
was a commune for a while.
Well, right behind it, if you're going toward Temple de Hirsch, there's a big brick mansion, the next house over. And that house was for sale. At the time, I think it was for $85,000. And my friend and I, a guy that I went to law school with, we looked at it and we concluded that the cost to heat it would be more than the mortgage payment. And so we didn't buy it. But that thing is probably worth $5 or $6 million now. So it's one of those I shoulda, coulda,
Yeah.
Well, when we bought our house on Capitol Hill, it was like $42,000. It wasn't very much, and we had moved from Maryland. We had sold that. We had bought that house in Chevy Chase, Maryland, for $38,000. It is probably worth no telling how much money now. Yeah, but that's the way it is. You can't-
I have a question. Did you eat the recipes that you wrote about before you
I'm
wrote
sorry,
them?
did I eat what?
Did you eat the recipes that you wrote about before?
Oh, low fat, absolutely. Yeah, my husband had coronary artery disease. We were very strict. Yes, definitely, we did.
Did you
and he was-
create the recipes? Did you create?
Oh,
them?
yeah.
Oh,
Some of them I would take a recipe and I'd cut out the fat and maybe add what I would do early on when I was writing. Instead of putting in fat, I would putting in salt and sugar. I would use a lot of herbs, basil, oregano, things like that. And I would use, instead of sugar, I would use fruit, which has a lot of sugar in it, but you would get some vitamins and minerals from eating fruit that you wouldn't ordinarily get. And
You're certainly a trailblazer, huh?
Well, I was one of the early ones. Nathan Pritikin started it, and he
Bill.
but and he was doing it. So I was, yeah, I was, and as I say, I got asked to do some of these other things along the way, which was very, I was in the right place at the right time.
How about
Would
the
you-
trail food? Did you cook
No.
up any of that?
No, that I did not do. And that I did not do. And in fact, I was invited to Fort Snelling. They were doing a big reenactment, and they invited me and wanted me to set up a fire and stuff. And I said, you know, I at this point, I said, I just write about the food, and I did not test it. And I said, if I had to make a fire, I would burn down the whole place. So no, I did not do it. Yeah, I did a few things. I did make portable soup once. Or the bouillon. What they did was to cook. They would cook beef and vegetables, and you'd cook it down and cook it down and cook it down, and then they dried it in the sun and made something that was almost like a bouillon cube, so they could carry it with them. They called it portable soup. And I did make that a couple of times and took it to demonstrations. I did a lot of talking around the state and California and different places. And so I would bring some of this food. And so I did make my own portable soup. And I mean, it worked. I would just cook things down and down and down. And then you had to dry it. And I had difficulty drying it. I mean, I didn't have difficulty drying it, but it did mold. And so nobody in the diaries and journals I read talked about mold, but it sure molded here in Seattle when I made.
How did they keep things from spoiling?
They didn't do a very good job, and they would probably eat it and cook it over a fire because they didn't have any refrigeration at all, and particularly the ones that came early, that were coming in the 40s. As the trail went on and as the railroads came and more people were coming out, and people on the West Coast knew that some of them were coming west, and the people that were entrepreneurs would come out with ice and food for the people to buy. But that was late, late in it wasn't the early people that were coming. It was a problem. So because you could just carry so much ice with you, they pack it in straw and things like that, but there was nothing like refrigeration, and they had to carry a little stove with them, and then they had to worry about getting something to light the stove. And so if nothing was, they would carry something like kerosene or something like that, but they could just carry so much, it was very dangerous. So they would try to, pick twigs, and coming across some of the prairies, there weren't any trees. And so it was a problem. It was very definitely a problem. And they didn't have a lot to eat by that time. Everything was gone, and they had to depend on who was going to come from the west, east to maybe bring them some stuff. So you can't say that what happened for one person happened for the other, another family. It depended on when you were coming. If you were wealthy and you could stock things, stock a lot of clothes and tarps and things, that helped. But a lot of people, so you had to have some money to start on the trail. It would be very difficult to start with nothing. I'm not saying that no one did, but for the most part, they were, quote, middle class people that were coming, because it was expensive to outfit a wagon and the whole thing, and children, and for kids to come across, and they would teach them they wanted to bring books to teach them how to read, and it's an interesting. There's as I say, a lot of books, interesting books written about it, and it was a special time in the country's history.
Jackie, this is an awkward question. But do you know if when they were on the trail and one of their animals died, like an oxen or a horse, would they cook it up?
Oh, you bet. Yeah, definitely.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, definitely. And the saddest thing was if somebody died, and many women died in childbirth, they would bury them right there. And that, I found that was the saddest thing. And I did go across the trail with a group. Not in a wagon. We were driving, but we went with the people that were going. And I did see some burial sites of young people, and which I found really very sad, because they had to bury them and leave them, and they were, never gonna be back that way again. And they also knew that they weren't going to see their families again. The probability of that happening was very, very slim. Once in a while, somebody else would come, maybe 10 years later, 5 years, and would come out. But for the most part, they knew they weren't going to see their families again. It was, you had to be pretty hardy soul to do that trip. It was not an easy one to do. I give them credit for having the stamina to do it. Immigrants have come to this country all the time. My grandparents came, and probably everybody's grandparents or great grandparents came over at some point. It was hard. You left your home when you stop and think about it, and no, it was a difficult trip.
I'm going to say goodnight. It's 11 o'clock here. So
Yes.
thank you very much for sharing all the information. And bye, everybody at Bed Off.
Bye,
Good night.
Linda.
Night, night, Linda.
Night, Linda.
There's another Linda.
Sure. Yeah, we have two Linda Morrises. The one that said goodnight is Linda Morris from Michigan.
Are you from Seattle?
Yes.
Yeah.
You've sat next to me at services long time ago.
And we had such things. Yeah.
Yeah, when we had to, yeah.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to them again.
All right, so do we have any more questions?
I have a
Ellen,
question. If people were middle class and they had to leave their families behind, what was the motivation? I understand the motivation of, like, I don't know, the European explorers, or our ancestors, because they were leaving something awful. And so you're willing to take a lot of risk in that case. But how about for these people? Was it just the hope, the adventure, or the hope that something would be even better than what they had? Or was there actual hardship that was driving them?
well, I think everything. I think a lot of them, the sense that they could own land. 160 acres is a lot of land. And, they might have been from Chicago, or, big cities on the East Coast. And so this was an opportunity for them to expand and have a land for their families to grow, and have a farm and animals. So I think it was that. There were some single people that came, and that was probably adventure. There were a few women who came without families and came out. Some of them a few of them had been nurses, and they came out. But there was that little sense of the unknown and wanting to do something like that. But most of it, I think, was economic and wanting a large land and to grow with your family. I think that was, but there was a group of women that came out and later on, not early, but they did come out here. But yeah, it was, it's hard to put yourself in that mindset of almost 200 years ago. That is, it's hard for me, although we moved around, and coming to Seattle, I felt like we were coming to the wilderness. My parents, I know, thought we were coming to the wilderness. See a tape. Any more questions?
I have one. Your interest in low fat, low sugar was all Pritikin, or was the sugar part, did that come from some other source?
No, well, my interest was in saving my husband's life. And that's what was my interest, is doing that. And so there were other people starting to talk about that. The American Heart Association was starting to talk about that. There was a Dr. Savage, who was a heart surgeon who lived across the street from us. And I think he wrote something for the book, but he didn't. I remember asking him about low-fat foods, but he really didn't seem to be terribly interested in it. But the American Heart Association was starting to, but they didn't go far enough. Theirs was cutting back, and they were paying a big difference between saturated and unsaturated fat. And but Pritikin was really getting into really eliminating fat. And if you followed his precisely, you really cut it back to maybe 10% of your calories, or maybe a little more than that. But it's, as I say, there's fat in just about everything. So to get zero, but it was really more what you added on top of what you ate. And Pritikin was saying, practically have a vegetarian diet. I mean, he didn't come out and say vegetarian, but he certainly said cut back a lot on the meat and emphasize fish and lean meat. So we did that, and we were practically vegetarians. We had very little meat in our diet, and did have some fish. Did a lot with fish, and living out here, it was easy to get fish. But some places you couldn't get it. So we did, and I did cook that way. We did it. And I say Buddy followed it diligently. What it got him was getting a transfusion that had, before they were testing for hepatitis C, and it had hepatitis C in the blood, and which they didn't know about. And that's what did him in. I mean, he had other problems with his heart, but that's what really was the diagnosis that killed him, was the hepatitis C. And they came out, I think, with a drug for it right after he died. But at the time, they didn't have it. The university was doing some research on that. And we went to somebody at the university to talk about it, but it didn't come out until a few years later. Anybody else? As you can see, I can talk forever.
Well, thank you, Jackie. I've heard this twice, last night and tonight.
You're going to give it the third time, Stu.
It's been fascinating. This was more fascinating, seriously more fascinating than last night. You're a treasure trove of information, and I want to thank you for sharing it with us.
Well, I thank you. It's been an honor to been asked to do this. It's a great honor to be asked. I thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you. Um,